Thank you very much to everybody at Scale for having me come and join you today, and in particular Mark for being brave enough to let me use his laptop. So I'm Amanda Brock, and I'm just working his laptop out. Is that going to work? Yeah. So I'm the CEO at Open UK, and Open UK is the industry organisation for open technology, and I'm going to spend a few minutes actually talking you through what we do because I think it's useful. And I suspect that most of you have never come across me or Open UK before, so I hope that's all right. If it's going on too long, let me know. I'm Scottish, so I have an accent, and I tend to speak quite quietly, and I may well forget that I'm supposed to hold the mic up. So if you can't hear me at any point in time, or if I'm walking in front of the screen where the slides get messed up, will you let me know? Just wave at me and we can work out what the issue is. So I often get asked what a nice girl like me is doing in a space like open source. Back at the beginning of 2008, I joined a company some of you will have heard of. I can't tell with masks on, but I don't think I worked with anybody in this room there. I know some of my former colleagues are here. And Canonical at the time was the commercial sponsor of the Ubuntu operating system, which was pretty popular back then. I'm just going to move these. And today, Canonical is probably known for many things beyond Ubuntu. But back then, we were at a time when we were doing deals with Dell, we were in the desktop space, and we also had just started to work in cloud. And Canonical went from being about 0% to over 70% of the cloud operating system market almost overnight. And it was a bit of a sign of what things were going to be in the future, the sign of things to come that we saw back then. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. So, having spent 5 years at Canonical, where I was the first lawyer, I was the general counsel, I moved into a law firm and spent a couple of years where I advised startups primarily and UK businesses around open source. And that was 2013-14. I was very much too early stage, and I ended up going back into a couple of other companies until 2019. And through that period from 2008 to 2019, I have been on a number of different advisory boards and open source projects because something happened at Canonical that wasn't expected. And I was expected to go in there and be a corporate and commercial lawyer who knew about IT and technology, but I wasn't expected to fall in love with open source. And for me, the value set that went with the open source community at the time and the work they were doing was really important. There are some chairs if you want them, sort of round and about. There's one right at the front that's not next to anyone if you want space. So that whole piece with Canonical for me was a very big deal. And it led to me being on things like the UN's Open Source Advisory Board, where I was the chair. Last year, I ended up being appointed by the UK government to an Open Standards Board that they have at the Cabinet Office. And then this year, I stood for election for the first time in my life, and it was really nerve-wracking, to be honest, for the OSI board. And I did it. Some people told me not to. And I did it because I feel that the OSI is really important to open source, and it's something that needs to be strong. I think it's absolutely critical that we have a strong OSI. We have a booth here, and if anybody wants to talk to the OSI people or myself about it, I'm sure we're all happy to do that. So something I found that I could do during the pandemic was write. And generally I write for the tech press. I like it because it's lightweight, it's short. I was persuaded to take on the second edition of this book, and I've edited a book of 24 chapters by 22 authors, free and open source software, law, policy, practice. The authors are world-leading experts in what they do, each and every one of them. And it is the only time you will ever see my name as an editor on the front of a book, because it is the most horrendous task I've ever undertaken. You imagine, mostly they're lawyers, 22 of them. They've all got opinions, and it's a really long book. Some of them are 15,000-word chapters. So it's going to be really expensive, and Oxford University Press are publishing it for us this autumn. However, it's also going to be open access, thanks to the Veitch Foundation. So I hope that it's something that will be used widely as a tool where you can use the PDF or the e-reader and download the bits that you need or you find useful. So that should be out September, October. We're going to do a book signing at All Things Open. And the other thing I do is talk. And pre-pandemic, I used to travel the world talking. Obviously, I'm here again today. But then I spent a couple of years in my kitchen with my kitten, who is now a fully grown cat. I was going to say, because I expected this room to be empty, that at least then I knew that there was one person or one kitten listening to me. And I'm really taken aback by you all being here. But of course, scale brought me on this incredible journey. And these are some photos from my incredible journey a couple of days ago. I couldn't believe the journey I had. We went over the north of Greenland, the Rockies, and Salt Lake City on the way here. Absolutely incredible to be with you. And to talk about Open UK a little bit, and I'll try and keep it quite short because I could talk to you about this for hours. We are the UK organisation for the business of open technology. Don, do you want to wave? So Don Foster is one of my board members. We're quite a different organisation, and we started being different when the board came on board, it's hard to say, at the beginning of 2020. And we have a board of 12 who are generally known in their areas in technology globally. And we made a decision that we wouldn't focus anymore on open source software. So Open UK had started life as an open source software organisation, but we didn't think you could run a country or geographic or even a project properly without focusing on data as well and understanding the place of data in software. And we expanded it out to the 3 opens, so open source software, hardware, and data. And what we've done is build an organisation over the last 2.5 years that has about 100 to 150 people who volunteer, and they are the leadership. Most of them are leaders in projects within the UK or international projects. So we tried to build quite a diverse organisation. I think it's probably one of the most diverse in UK tech, maybe in open source. So we have our board, we have pro bono leadership team, only a couple of us are paid. And then we have ambassadors. A lot of them are from Kubernetes and Cloud Native. And what we've done by bringing those people in is we've started the process of building a cohesive community, building a community that can be recognised within the UK. Now bear with me, this has a relevance to government. So we brought these people together so they can have a voice. And we do things like award ceremonies. We have an honours list, a very British thing, where we celebrate their achievement and what they work on. And what that does is allow us to have influence, because we can demonstrate that we have these smart people doing clever things with open and the benefits of that open source, that open technology. And there's a whole list there, you know, you'll see these in the slides. But we were very quickly recognized in Europe as the voice of open. We then joined an amicus brief and Google v. Oracle here in the US, and we also responded to the Biden ordinance last year. I think we were the only non-US organization that did that. And last year we shifted to starting to do reports. Now I know I'm disappointing at least one person in the room because I'm not going to go into detail on case studies, but these reports do. So what we did was we started by taking the data that existed in other reports and doing a literature review and cutting that data for the UK so we could demonstrate stuff that nobody had shown before by looking at the UK. It's probably easier to do that for other countries because Brexit sort of messed it up for us, where most people focused on Europe. And what we were trying to do there was demonstrate our position as a centre of excellence. I don't think this has been published anywhere, but when the UK Brexited, the figure Europe was using was 490,000 developers doing open source work in Europe. After Brexit, they think it's 260. So almost half of Europe's developers doing open source work are in the UK. Germany is very close behind us, and then there's a big drop down to France, and then for some of the other countries it's tiny. And that's the kind of information that helped us influence government and helped us get a connection with government. So we started with the literature review. We moved on in phase 2 to doing a survey. Our surveys are difficult, right? So I want to ask questions that survey organizations tell you can't ask. And I keep pushing and pushing until I get them sort of close to what I want. Because I think the way we've looked traditionally at open source is we look at value generated by number of developers, lines of code, and that gives you a very skewed idea, a total cost of ownership type idea, which is a decade old. That worked in tech 10 years ago. It's not how the rest of the tech sector measures itself. And what I think we need to shift to is looking more at value and the value that open source generates. We did calculations following the methodologies, these traditional methodologies, and we showed that open source software purely was 20% of the UK's GDP year on year. Now, I think it's probably 3 times that if you look at the value it generates and think about the platform economy. And then we shifted in the third phase, and if only I could change the world, and maybe it is changing, we looked at values and sustainability because we were hosting COP26 and we had an event at COP26. So we looked at other things that you could measure, like collaboration, education, skills development, all the good things that happen through open source that aren't economic. And we've been working on how we measure that. Now, this does all relate to government, I promise. This is just from this year's report we shared on the 7th of July. It's long, it's 50, 60 pages, and the intention was it was a full report and we weren't going to do 3 phases. But for various reasons that I'll come to later, we're going to do a second phase on curation of open source and infrastructure, particularly focused on the public sector, and then a third phase on sustainability. And if you look at this up here, you'll see this sum, the 4.87 to 6.65 billion. That's a calculation we did on the amount that's invested by UK enterprises in open source software. And it's incredible. We have a thing called the Levelling Up Fund, where UK government is building technology to help bring us back out of the pandemic. This sum is 29 to 35 times the amount UK government is putting in. There's a huge amount of open source happening. And one of the things that I think we all have to do when we talk about government is find ways to demonstrate the importance of open source. Now, everything we've got in here is Creative Commons. The questions from our surveys are also at the end of the reports, and they're filled with case studies. So I think there were about 8 last year. There's a similar number in this year's report, and we have more that we'll share in September and November. So if you want case studies, they're good examples, and I'm also happy if anybody wants it to share things like the questions we used. And we just keep evolving and learning. Every 2 months we have a group that does a collaborative session, and we try to bring together people around the world who are looking at reporting, who are looking at surveys and open source, so that we can compare notes and learn from each other. And it's a completely open list if anyone's interested. And what we saw in this report in phase 1 is that you're on a journey when you start with open source. And I'm going to say I think this is a journey that every company today is on, because we've all digitalized. Like it or not, over the last 10, 12 years, companies that didn't like it have done it through the pandemic. They've started to digitalize, they've fully digitalized, and they've become companies that focus on having their products and services created, distributed, or consumed using technology, which means it's software defined. And that's got a huge impact on everything we do. And what we try to do, and these are the questions that the survey people don't like, is we try to correlate activities around governance, good housekeeping, compliance, good technology development. We try to correlate them to the stage in the journey and also the length of time that companies had been at each stage. And it's not necessarily exclusive, so you might get somebody who contributes and consumes. I think the figure was 7% that consumed only but didn't contribute. The bit that I'm really interested in, because this is how I am, is those who consume and distribute but don't contribute. And I'm not allowed to use what we saw from that because we had under 2%, but there's still 2% of companies who are using open source knowingly, distributing it, and not giving anything back. And I really want to investigate that further. I mentioned that we did an event at COP26 last year. We shared a blueprint for the data center of the future using open source software, hardware, data. The blueprint's now in the Eclipse Foundation. This year we're going to host another event in November. We're going to try and hold ourselves accountable for what we talked about last year and where we've got to a year later. And we're going to do another blueprint which will be on EV charging, and we'll bring together all the different components of EV charging into a blueprint, and it will also go into Eclipse. The idea is that we show that this blueprint model is feasible and rigorous, and then we will next year share the model and try and get others own, probably in medical devices. We also are going to be doing something called the societal value metrics, looking at the non-economic values of open source. So this second piece of what we do, this policy and legal work, is a huge chunk of what we do. We, I guess, are unique because we try to bring all this engineering community together, all this business community together, so that we can then have influence. You know, when people see the achievements that are made, when people in government understand the achievements that are made in their own patch, in their own geography, they're willing to listen to you. And we then try to direct the conversation. But the third piece has to be about learning. And I didn't take this out of my bag earlier, which I should have. So purely by chance, we were having a kids competition when the pandemic started. And we were going to distribute these digital gloves. I knew I would do that. So it's basically a glove with a microbit, which is also created in the UK, and a battery pack. And I probably can't do this. Not with the mic. Yeah, the little microbit goes in here. And if you look at openuk.uk/openkidscamp, you'll see these, and you'll see two courses teaching children. For the UK, it's age 11 to 15, Key Stage 3. And it teaches them how to code, it teaches them about open source, it teaches them about collaboration, about community through 10 digital lessons, and then there's 10 magazines that go with it. Now, I'm going to take this off again, having gone to all that trouble putting it on. We gave away 8,000 of those gloves to kids in these little packs like this. And you'll see the back of it has 10 images, and those are the open source definition. So we try to take some responsibility and teach the next generation about the open source definition, but we also taught them about the Sustainable Development Goals and about community and collaboration. And in the first course, we got to be a GNOME Community Challenge finalist. I think we were runner-up. And this year, we're looking at building a MOOC, a massive open online course with the entrepreneurship school at Scottish University. And the idea there is that we'll start to teach people who want to build businesses about things like how you hire from communities, how you grow communities, how you build revenue when you've given away your crown jewels. And we're a tiny organisation. I've shown you, everybody that really leads it. Yet we've been able to get this level of press, and we get over 1 million impressions on Twitter. We've got a lot more than that this year. But it's because everybody works together to have influence. And we started this at the beginning of 2020. At the same time, what we saw was a shift. And I've mentioned digitalisation already. We saw this shift going on around us at a government level, not just in the UK, but also in Europe. And Europe was talking about the start of a digital decade in 2020. And we're all really optimistic. Now, you probably realise I don't speak to words, but this quote is worth knowing. And this is Ursula von der Leyen, who is the President of the European Commission. And this is a quote from a letter that she wrote to a lady called Marguerite Vestager, who is the Antitrust or Competition Commissioner. And when she appointed her, she said, "Changes in digital technologies and geopolitics are already having a profound effect on the lives of Europeans. We're witnessing major shifts all the way from global power structures to local politics. What we do now will determine what kind of world our children live in and will define Europe's place in the world, creating a Europe fit for the digital age." So if you take those words and you change it to be UK or US or British or American, this is the situation we're all in. We're all looking at the same thing, maybe collaboratively, maybe not. We're all trying to work out what's going on with the future through technology. And we see how technology impacts our day-to-day lives, and our day-to-day lives impact technology. Now, this is a photograph at a conference I was talking to some of you about earlier, FOSDEM, and this was my last pre-pandemic conference. And it's first Sunday of February every year. And for us, it was 31st of January and 1st of February. And of course, the UK Brexited or exited from Europe on the 31st of January, and we were in Brussels. So we went to the European Commission. And here I'm with Cheryl Hung, who you might know from Cloud Native, Jonathan Riddle from KDE, and Kavita Kapoor, who was our learning officer. And we were at the Commission at midnight as we exited, and the lights went off. And we were standing there in the dark in January, February, and it really felt profound. And that was a moment of geopolitical shift that you could pin down to the exact moment in time. And there are a few that you can do that with. This is the little known Scottish variant that one or two of you may have come across, and you can generally tell it's coming because of the noise it makes. Now, geopolitical shift, digitalization were both really impacted in the last couple of years through the pandemic. And one of the things we saw was the European reaction to data being data flows, data privacy from Europe to the US. And what we saw was this case, Schrems 2, where previously Mr. Schrems had brought a case, and the case had the impact that the model clauses, the contract clauses we used to move data from Europe over to the US were set aside. And we used to, I used to be a lawyer, and we just used to pick those up, stick them in a contract, and know everything was good. So the case said you couldn't do that anymore, and you had to start to rely on the ability to shift data because the US had a safe harbor. Schrems 2, halfway through the pandemic, 2020, partway through the pandemic, sets that aside and says the US is no longer a safe place for us to transfer data from Europe to. We see the start of digital and data sovereignty in Europe. And I don't know if you've come across that term sovereignty, but it's absolutely constant now in Europe. And Gaia X is the business infrastructure, building a cloud for Europe, a federated infrastructure that can be used for data and create privacy, but it's something that's all built on open source and looking at open data. We don't just see that friction, though, between the EU and the US. We also see it between the EU and China, and we see it between the US and China, and the UK and China. And we don't just see these things happening at a national state geopolitical level. We also start to see civilian and civil action through Black Lives Matter, through the youth movement at COP26, and of course, sadly, this year in the war in Ukraine. So why am I talking about all of this? Why does it matter? Why is it relevant to your government track? And what's it got to do with open source? And what is open source even? So I told you I joined Canonical, and I was a lawyer, and I could have written a 2-line open source is code with the source code, which is the human readable part, shared publicly on an OSI approved license. And that would have given me a basic definition of open source, and I could have applied it to everything. But if I'd done it, it wouldn't have worked, because open source is much, much more than that. Open source is about community, it's about collaboration, it's about contribution, it's about building the best, most innovative code that's something that is diverse, that will be well maintained and secure. It's a big picture. And you can go back to the OSD, and in the OSD, the open source definition, which is custodianed by the Open Source Initiative, as you all know, you'll find a couple of principles around things like non-discrimination, non-discrimination amongst people, non-discrimination amongst fields of endeavour. And those have had a really big impact in the last year or two, particularly when you start to think about these geopolitical shifts and the way that we're trying to close down the world and split countries off, yet as open source communities we continue to collaborate. And this is the kind of thing that governments have to understand. So how did we get to where we are? I've mentioned digitalization. Digitalization has been a big, big thing over the last decade, but it's not just that. We also have this situation where the role that the developer plays has changed. The engineer's role is totally different. So when I was back in Canonical, it was pretty exhausting, actually. I was that parrot, and I was the point of escalation for every commercial deal. And I spent my days talking to procurement, talking to legal, sometimes finance, explaining risk and open source, and trying to persuade them that it wasn't as bad as they thought. And that's shifted. That's not an issue anymore. If the companies are smart, they'll know that you don't manage your risk and open source around contracts. You manage it at the engineering level, because today, engineers can make the decision to go and bring open source into their organization without approval, without a contract. And what that means is that not only has the risk shifted, but the power of the engineer has escalated and risen. They've got an elevated status. If you're providing open source, what that means is that it's very, very easy for you to have your product become ubiquitous without having to go through that risk management of legal and procurement. So that shift is one of the biggest things that most people don't acknowledge which has really seen the rise of open source. And when you look at reports around open source, you'll see 58 to 98% of the stack generally credited, whether you're in the public or private sector, as being open source. And this is partly why. Partly digitalization, partly the fact that the developers have this elevated status, and partly cloud. Now, I mentioned also that we were dealing with that back in 2010 in Canonical, and this is an old slide, I really need to update it. But if you look at the cloud native landscape, you'll see what market cap in the trillions and funding in the billions. Now, the fact that open source permeates that cloud is inescapable, and it's got a huge amount to do with why open source has become what it's become and why the stacks are full of it. Now, I'm going to tell you that, and so would he. So don't listen to us. I don't know if anybody follows Steve Wally on Twitter, but I was having a conversation with him this morning about this slide. So this is Steve Wally's slide. He's not able to be here now. And Steve tells the Microsoft story. And this is him in 2018 doing a keynote in Edinburgh. And he's at the Linux Foundation's Open Source Summit. Now, there isn't anybody who was at Canonical with me in the room, is there? Right, so back in the day, when I joined Canonical, we had something called Launchpad, and it was a bug tracking system. And Bug Zero was the destruction of Microsoft. Microsoft were not our friend. In fact, we thought they were public enemy number one. I can't tell open source jokes anymore because all the jokes I know, the punchline is Microsoft. Things have changed. Things have changed to the extent that in 2018, Steve's standing on a stage in Scotland asking for forgiveness. Now, Ballmer described open source when he was a CEO of Microsoft as a cancer. Steve's got Satya Nadella behind him on this screen saying, "Judge us by the actions we have taken in the recent past, our actions today and in the future." And Steve tells a really good story. It's 13 minutes long. It's worth downloading and watching if you're trying to persuade someone to use open source. And he explains there are 3 reasons. The first is that Microsoft customers never used to ask for open source. The second is developers who've learned to code in the last 20 years use open source. There is no way around it. You can't employ them if you're not going to let them do it, because they're going to reuse and recycle and use open source methodologies. And the third is cloud, back to that point I was just making. And what he said is that you can't engage in cloud at any scale without dealing with the communities. So it's no good just being a user. You want to be further along that journey and contributing if you want to have any influence. Now, I mentioned Microsoft back in the day, and we used to call it FUD. I don't know if people still do. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And I'm very quickly going to run through 3 situations that are current where there is fear, uncertainty, and doubt that I think impacts what you're all doing with governments. So the first is something called strip mining. You've probably all heard of it. It's a 1970s New York piece of law, and it's about coal mining. And it's about taking too much from the land and not leaving enough to sustain for the future. And back in 2019, this is a piece from the New York Times, where the New York Times interviewed 7 open source founders who were not happy with AWS. You've got AWS people in the room. It's all right, I'm not going to be nasty. So they talked about strip mining, and they said that Amazon was doing something wrong because they were taking their software. Now, do you remember I said I worked in a law firm for 2 years advising startups? I came up with this very quick way of letting people go. And I used to say to them, what if? So what if you open source your software and someone else uses it? And most people got that that's what open source is. Second, what if you open source your software and someone else uses it to make money? And they weren't always comfortable. Third, and remember, I'd just come out of Canonical. What if someone else uses your software and makes a shed load of money, and you don't make any, or you don't make as much, or you don't make enough? And usually they would leave. So I put a lot of people off open sourcing in their businesses and building their businesses around it. But I did the right thing, because open source is not one thing. It is not a business model. So when you're looking at open source and its sustainability, you need to understand what you can do with it and how it will be used by others, and what your business model will be if you want to generate revenue. And that has to be totally separate from how you open source and what you open source. So Amazon did nothing wrong because the OSD and the licenses allow others to take your code and commercialize it. There's nothing you can do about it. If you don't want them to do it, you shouldn't open source it. There's nothing to stop you sharing the code and using a proprietary license like SSPL. The problem we have is FUD. So things like this, many of you will have seen this back in 2020 when Elastic moved Elasticsearch onto the SSPL, which is a proprietary license. And that also is fine. But the issue is the headline doubling down on open, when in fact what they're doing is moving away from open. And there's a nice lawyer word, disingenuous, that I like to use about that. So that's the first sort of piece of FUD, is the confusion about what open source is and trying to apply licenses that aren't OSI approved. Second issue is really heartbreaking. So back in March, just after the war in Ukraine started, and I don't know how that is in the US, but for us in Europe, or in the UK, we're still in Europe, it really feels close. It's been really, really tough. And 8 developers got on Twitter and started to talk to us about putting down their keyboards and taking up arms. It was really heartbreaking. So at Open UK, we set up a Red Cross donation line for open source to contribute, and we raised a few £1,000s. Only last week, I mean, the war is ongoing. There was a piece in the Financial Times talking about it being the first open source war because of the impact technology is having. And I had to turn down a friend. So I've worked in Ukraine years ago, and I was asked to get involved with some of this protestware. And what protestware does is restrict who can use code, and I wouldn't get involved because that's not open source. And it doesn't matter what people are doing, whether it's a war, there will be other wars too, I'm sure, where you can't restrict who can use your code in the same way. And again, protestware is sort of bringing open source into disrepute. And then the third thing that I'm going to talk about quickly, because I have quite a few slides here, if you're interested in it, it's detailed, it's technical, and you should read it. The third thing is very much around standards. And there are a number of standards that use standard essential patents. Now, whatever you think about patents doesn't really matter. They exist, and these people have patents, and the SEPs are distributed under FRAND, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory licenses. The problem is you have to pay for them, and they don't work with open source. And what we're seeing is a lot of misinformation being spread to standard bodies and through them by a few companies. And the few companies are known, where they are talking about what open source means and trying to imply it's something entirely different from what it is to make their standards work. And there's a lot of work needing done in this area. Back in the day at Canonical, I was interviewed by the Department of Justice when they were talking about the Rockstar patents. Rockstar was a consortium with Microsoft and Apple and others who bought the Nortel patent suite when Nortel was split up. And what they were doing was transferring those patents in a way that could be used to attack open source, but with a license that allowed themselves to use it. Now, the reason I mention it isn't to dwell in the past. It's the fact that they came up with a solution which was either to use a GPL license or give open invention network rights, which allow you to use each other's patents without cost and without suing each other. It's a cross license, and it's free, and anybody can sign up. And as we see this journey that companies go on like Microsoft, we see Microsoft signing up to that. And a few years ago, it was a really big deal when Microsoft put their patents into OIN. So I'm still not talking about the public sector, right? But I am, because all of this is applicable to enterprise and to the public sector and to government if they're using open source. And we've talked about open source creating value and about total cost of ownership and how you measure it and the economics of open source, which are really important to how you use it and how you get others to use it, particularly when you go through procurement processes in government. And you'll notice here this starts to talk about digital infrastructure. And digital infrastructure is where our government's going today. 10 years ago in the UK, we were one of the first countries in the world to have an open first policy. There was a Cabinet Office decision, a Cabinet Office advisory board that I was on, and they decided that we should use open source more across UK government. And they created something called GDS, Government Digital Services, which is now 10 years old. which was world leading. It's been replicated across the globe in places like Australia and Canada. Francis Maud, Lord Maud, and Liam Maxwell, who is now at AWS in the public sector group, they were behind this, and they created something that was really innovative. But of course, we were talking about this before, about changes in government. And there was a change in the leadership, and it sort of got brushed under the carpet a bit. This year, we got a new digital strategy in the UK, and our government's digital strategy does not mention open source anywhere. So they shared it with me the weekend before, under embargo, and I spent the whole weekend going back and forwards with their press office trying to persuade them to write the word open source in it. And they just kept coming back saying, don't worry, Amanda, open source is a given for us. So I'm now working to try and get them to clarify that. We have here something called a playbook, and this is where it gets interesting. So governments can have these policies or not. If they have these policies, it's a bit like my lawyer's definition from the beginning of my talk. Open source is something where the code is shared, where the public, the human readable source code is put on something like a repo like Git, GitHub, GitLab, and it's also under an open source approved license. And that's all well and good, but unless you know how to do it, it doesn't work. And through the course of this year, we've done a lot of work with the healthcare system in the UK, with the NHS. I've interviewed about 20 different case studies, and we've worked with the NHS on a report for their internal usage. And what I would say that I saw from that and other interaction in the public sector and government is that they use open source because they want to achieve economic value. And they do that for two reasons: to avoid vendor lock-in and to create code that can be reused and recycled. But of course, if you don't know how to do that, and you don't know how to do it well, you don't understand the governance, you don't understand contribution, then you end up with something that's not usable. And that's where something like this playbook comes in. It's not as good as it should be, and they are updating it, but it is an attempt to start to give government the guidance. So I'm putting all of this on slides for you, so if you want to go and find assets later, you can. And we see how government now is using open source, and it's doing it for many reasons and in many ways, but a lot of that is also like enterprise use. And it starts with things like apps, and we talked, a few of us at the beginning of this, about the impact that COVID had, about the apps that were used, Test and Trace being one of them. And in the UK, our Test and Trace app is possibly not the best. Our rollout of our vaccine using something called COVID Calculator, which is an NHS case study of in one of our reports, I think the last one. Those are maybe better, but you see government shifting from simply using open source and apps and the like to policies like our healthcare policy, which requires open source first. The UK's energy sector, the Digitalisation Task Force, reported in January saying that they want to build a spine built on open source software. So we move from just apps to infrastructure, and we're trying to work out what infrastructure means, because our national infrastructure, like an enterprise's infrastructure, and our national critical infrastructure is being built on open source. And then, of course, last May, we have President Biden and the White House start to focus on supply chain, start to focus on SBOMs, software bill of materials, start to look at this infrastructure and panic. And I'll come to that more in a minute, and curation. I mentioned already that we responded to this White House ordinance from Open UK. We were thinking about this about 18 months ago, but then everybody's mind got focused last year in the run-up to Christmas with Shell4J. We see OpenSSF growing up, and we see OpenSSF having 2 meetings in the last year with the White House, talking about security, talking about how we make open source secure for that national infrastructure and for that public sector and government usage. And they've come up with a 10-point plan. And only, 10 days ago? I don't know what date it is. The Cyber Safety Review Board come up with their report on Shell4J. And then on Monday this week, Atlantic Council, which is a policy organisation focusing on security, one of their team published this article, Open Source Security, How Digital Infrastructure is Built in a House of Cards. Now, it's a sensation-grabbing headline, but it's a concern. And it's actually, it's a good article, it's well written, it's done a lot of research. I don't agree with everything in it. But it focuses the mind on the thing that I want you to take away from this talk. And the thing I want you to take away is that for all the reasons I've explained, our public sector and our governments are using open source software. And they're doing it in a way that they initially started to procure to avoid lockdown, to create code that was reusable, but without understanding what that meant, without understanding how to do it. So it was fine at a top level creating that policy, but as you cascade it down, if people don't know how to do it, you might as well throw your money away. You know, you're going and commissioning open source that's put on GitHub, that's not recyclable, not reusable, not maintained, not secure, because you haven't explained to them how to do it. And I think for the public sector, this piece is critical. And what we get to is a point in time where on this side, what you've got is open source coming from communities, coming from businesses, coming from collaborations of businesses. And on this side, you've got government infrastructure. And down the middle here, you've got a road. Matt, do you want to sing? So if I could sing, I'd be singing LA is a great big freeway, but I can't sing, so I'm not going to. So you have this freeway like the one you see out of this hotel window with cars flying down it, and you've got to get from here where you've built your open source to here where it's your app, where it's your critical infrastructure or just infrastructure. Now you could be like Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner, and you could just fly into the traffic and across the road and get splatted. You could be conservative or perhaps smart and go to the narrowest point in the road and find an underpass or find a zebra crossing, I don't know what you call them. And that already exists with things like RHEL, with Red Hat Enterprise Linux, with Google's new product, with other procured or curated open source. You could find out how to get across the road safely yourself and build those skills in your own team. Or you could go and pay somebody over here who might have a good idea of how to get across the road. But somehow you are going to have to get from one side to the other, because the people who distribute that software distribute it without warranty. And they specifically say you have no rights to come back against them if something is wrong with it. Yet over here you want to use it perhaps for air traffic control, perhaps for your energy sector to build a spine. How are you going to balance the two? Now the word that I'm hearing that I think is going to be the buzzword is curation. How do you curate open source from here to here? And I think what's going to happen is that we're going to see bodies being built called stewards. That's my word. I call them stewards. And there's an economist in the UK at LSE called Mariana Mazzucato, not a very British name, but she's based in the UK. And she wrote a book called Mission Economics. And if you read her work, part 4, she starts to talk about data and how data will be managed by the state. And what she talks about is building public-private partnerships and engagement. And I think that's where we're going to end up with these stewards. Now, I don't know if we can build one, you know, it's like the Coca-Cola advert all around the world and everybody's happy. We'll end up with is state by state, country by country, perhaps sector by sector within those countries, perhaps coordinated across countries, I don't know. But I suspect to get from here to here, for the energy sector or the UK energy sector, we need a steward. And that steward will be a body that makes the approval of the journey across from one side to the other, and that curation of open source software. And at Open UK, we've actually started this work. We've got 2 sectors that are interested and at very, very early stages. And we're hoping in about 6 months' time, we'll have a minimum viable product to start to talk about. Now, economists never used to interest me, but I find myself looking at them more and more in the last few years as I try to justify open source to government. And there's a second economist, a woman called Kate Raworth, who wrote a book you might know called Donut Economics, talking about, if you don't know it, you should read it. It's talking about how we change society and capitalism and recreate capitalism in a different way, in a more equitable way. But Kate talks about open source software specifically, and when she talks about it, she talks about recharacterizing open source as a digital public good. Now, I know that this is an old concept for some, but I think it's time that we really started to have the conversation with our public sector and with our governments, because to get from here to here costs, And these people also need contribution back. The maintainers and others need contribution back to the open source projects. And if you read the Atlantic Council piece, they're saying that money won't fix it, but money will help. And I think it is time that we started to encourage our governments to look at open source as a digital public good and to work collaboratively around that. So I've talked for about as long as I want to. I think 2020 is I know 2020 is the year of the tiger, and I think it's the year of the open source tiger. And this is a piece that I wrote that has a number of recommendations and tips about open source in 2020. Thank you for indulging me and going on a journey with me, because I wanted to take you through an understanding of how my thought process got here. But I think when you look at the individual case studies today, when you listen to others talking about the public sector, about government use of open source, you can't just go ahead and replicate it. You have to understand why you're doing it, what you're doing it, and what you need from government. And what we need is engagement and understanding of this journey. Anybody want to ask me any questions? Don't just look at me. It's like being back in the kitchen with the cat. He won't ask questions either. Yes. Are you okay using the bag? So I think the way that I balance that personally, I'm not speaking for anybody else, is that open source is a specific thing. And the specific thing is set out for me in the open source definition. And part of that is that anybody can use. Now, I don't want to be the judge and jury. I don't want that to change. I want it to be absolutely open for everybody and for every usage. I think it's then up to the individual whether they feel that there are restrictions they want to place on something. And if they can't share it on an open source basis, with what that means, they shouldn't. They should just not open source it. I'm not in a position to, We had a chap called Nicholas Challen speak at Open UK about 3 weeks ago, and his video is on our website, and he talks about exactly this. He's ex-Department of Defence. And I don't think that is, I think it's a separate issue. The rights and the wrongs and the morals are not for open source. And if we start to get into that, we'll destroy it. I think what open source is about is the ability for everybody to collaborate without discrimination, which is why I'm concerned about what's happening with geopolitical shift. You know, I want everyone to be able to contribute. Now, to get back over here to your national critical infrastructure, when there's friction and geopolitical shift between countries, clearly we have to work that out and we have to talk about it. We can't ignore it. Can I go to the... And I meant to repeat the question, I've just remembered. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's the opposite. Yeah. They all have it. There isn't an open source approved license that doesn't disclaim liability, and it's really important. Yeah. Now you could, so just to pick up on what you're saying there, which is that going across the road could create a situation where there might be a risk of developer liability. I want to be really clear that this is not about creating liability on developers. It is about the opposite. Somebody standing in the middle of this road, we have lollipop men and women in the UK. I don't know if you have an equivalent. They have a stick with a circle at the top, and they take little kids across the road safely to school. What was it called? A crossing guard, right. I've learned something. So the crossing guard effectively could say, the crossing guard going across the road could say, and by the way, I'll make sure that if you get sued, you know, give me a few extra $100 and I will make sure that that liability is fixed. It's called insurance. And it's part of things like Red Hat Enterprise Linux. They have that rolled in. Back when I was at Canonical, we bought it for some of our products too. Some organizations will self-insure, some will do it through, you know, directly buying insurance policies. But there is a pool of indemnity there. But that's not something these people should take on. That's something that you take on in the crossing the road and the curation. It's really important. No, I'm glad you asked the question. I'm trying to get a cartoon made, and it's really hard because I've got Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner in my head, and I don't think they're out of copyright. But we're trying to get a cartoon showing to you if you try and do this without thinking it through. And I'll try and make sure that that's called out. Yes, SpongeBob, maybe. Does he play in the traffic? Yeah, I'm not doing Winnie the Pooh. It's not going there. Yeah. 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 So I really struggled to get anyone to listen to me for over a year. I'm still really taken aback by how many of you are in here today. I went through a year of knocking on doors, and I wrote a piece because I discovered I could write that the tech press published saying, where is the UK's digital strategy? And then they started to phone me back. It was really strange. And it was totally unexpected. I think you need to build resources that explain in practical and clear ways the value. Take what we've got, drop me an email and we can give you more. But things like, and I don't know your name, we were talking earlier about case studies. Things like case studies that prove the point. That statistic, if I can show you that 20% of the digital economy is based on open source, and much as I would like us to focus away from the economics, it's what government want to see, it's what politicians want you to talk about. I shouldn't really say this, but I'm going to. So we're trying to build something that will be announced in September that I'm not meant to be talking about, called an APPG, an all-party parliamentary group. And they're meant to be politically agnostic groups which the politicians engage with. And I'm partway through getting enough members of parliament from different parties to engage to allow us to do one. On the I am allowed to talk about this, but on the 19th of September, we are going to have an event in London called Infrastructure, Curation and Security. And we're hoping to have senior level politicians at that. We'll have a lot of panels and speakers looking at things like OSPOs and open source governance, looking at what security means from a technical perspective, what it means from a policy perspective. This curation piece and the stewards that I've been talking about, we're going to start the conversation about those. And the goal is that next spring we will have a big conference in London. So we all have to pray for Omicron and other variants not to happen, quiet or noisy, and that we can get together as much as possible in London. If anybody wants to go to that, I can't promise that I will be able to cover your travel, but I will get you free tickets if you're stuck to get into it. And the idea is that we bring as many people from around the world together to talk about these issues that our governments are facing. Because right now what you see is that the UK has its strategies. You see the US taking real leadership in the White House. I mean, what they did was really impressive on the S-bomb piece. And that focus on supply chain is really required. I was speaking to Kate Stewart from SPDX, who also did a talk for us. And Kate got a survey that shows something like 71 or 76% of US organizations now use S-bombs. We asked the question in our report, 21%. So it shows you, I mean, it's not hard and fast. I can't say it's a 50% difference, but there's clearly a difference between having a potential regulation and not. And being able to show things like that to politicians, to government, that's what makes the difference. That's what persuades them. Money's obviously number one for them, but particularly in the economy we're in, right? There's no point in pretending it's not the case. But sort of working collaboratively, come to the sessions that we do every couple of months, and meet the others in your space that are doing it. We use data from a chap called Avi Press at a company called Scarf. And one of the data points in my 9 key points about open source in the UK is the second one at the top. Now, Avi's company have started in January to look at how many downloads are happening in the UK. He didn't do the UK separately before, and it was sort of somebody obviously said, oh, Brexit, split them out. So in 5.5 months, we can show 11.9 million downloads of open source software packages. I suspect that by next year he'll have that more together, but I'm sure he'll share that data for other places. If you want it in a more granular way, you need to talk to Scarf about it. But there'll be multiple companies doing these kinds of things that we need to start engaging with, and we need to start collaborating and sharing that data. because it's the only way that we're going to have impact and influence. So to go back to your specific question is what would I do? One, I would start to be a nuisance and keep pushing people. I'm very resilient. I don't take anything personally, well, mostly. And I just keep going back and back and back and back and back and inviting and inviting and inviting until you wear them down. Secondly, I would start to write or find somebody who can write. And once you start to write, they'll start to ask you for quotes in the press. If somebody asks you for a press quote, you drop everything else and you give them the press quote. You do it first thing. So I often get them overnight, and I'm an early bird these days, so I get up and I've written them before anybody else has gone to work. So then we get the kind of press stats I showed you, purely down to being somebody who they can rely on to turn it around quickly. Not because I'm any smarter than anybody else. And that kind of thing makes a big difference. Be accessible. Take the time to explain things. I think with the people we work with in the public sector, I spend a lot of time going through some of the stuff I've explained to you, because they're really smart and they're really engaged and they're really interested, but a lot of them don't have a background in tech, or they don't have a background in business even. So trying to help them understand the implications of the laws and why we need better laws that encourage open, or why we need not just a policy but a playbook that technically will show people how to do it. And for the stuff we've got, everything is Creative Commons, so take our stuff. You know, it's not perfect, and if you've got feedback that we can improve it on, please give us it. Sorry. Open source is a movement, isn't it? It's a socio-political movement already. It's what I always say to the people who want to build code that has shared or public source but doesn't meet with the open source definition, is go and build your own movement, because it takes years, it takes energy, it takes money, and it takes time. We've got that. We just need to coordinate. And we need to make sure that we're all sharing and reusing our tools that we create within countries. That's why we're trying to set this thing up next spring to bring people together. But, you know, go and do others. But it's not an exclusive basis. The more that's done, the better. Any more questions? Yes. Yeah. 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 I think the private sector sees a lot of money in this. So I think the private sector, to quote you, sir, gives a shit. I also think that building those skills in-house is really important, and that's part of what we can all help with. Sorry, I said I think that building those skills in-house is definitely important. I think it's something we should be doing. And one of the things that we tried to show in our stats, in the survey we did, is that when you look about the benefits of open source beyond money, skills development is really high up there. And I suspect the US, like the UK, will show that skills development and technology is critical, and that they're way behind and that they haven't got enough of it and they need more of it. So being able to demonstrate that the open source communities bring more of that helps.